Once upon a time, it really didn't matter that a small group of people subscribed to some quite out there ideas. However, nowadays, most of us have probably encountered such people who reject the consensus of experts or scientists in favor of conspiracy theories. Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, and his new book offers some help. It's called How to Talk to a Science Denier: Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. And Lee McIntyre joins us now from Boston, Massachusetts. Good to have you on the program again, Lee. How you doing?
Okay, thank you so much for having me back.
Not at all. Let's start with this. How many science deniers' minds do you think you've been able to change over the years?
I'm not sure. The problem is this: it's very hard to change someone's mind on the spot. You can't think of this as a kind of a hit and run. The goal in talking to a science denier is first to build trust. And then once you think you've got something along those lines, then you can ask questions, begin to work in facts. And so maybe you won't even hear about it until later. So I'm hoping that it's a little bit like Johnny Appleseed, that I've changed more minds than I know.
Well, let's pick up on the subtitle of the book and talk about the flat earthers, because you did go to a convention for people who genuinely believe that the earth is flat. And then you sat down and had dinner with a speaker and tried to figure out what would change his mind. What happened next?
I was lucky that he was open to the idea that that was an important question, because the flat earthers tend to say that their view is not based on faith, it's based on evidence. And so then the next question that I wanted to ask them is, okay, so if you're trying to reason like a scientist, you should know what evidence could possibly change your mind. And so he was open to that. The next thing that happened is I said, okay, so, start telling me what you think might change your mind. And his first response was if he went up in a rocket and he could see the curved Earth from space. But then he took that back because he said, no, maybe the window in the rocket would be curved. At this point, I made a proposition, which was, how about if we fly over Antarctica? Because according to the Flat Earth International Conference folks, Antarctica is not a continent, it's a mountain range spread out around the perimeter of the Earth, which, by the way, would make it 24,000 miles long rather than, 1,000 or 1,500 miles. And he shook my hand on this because at first he said, well, those flights don't exist. And I said, well, yes, they do. And I pulled the itinerary out of my pocket because I was ready for him. And then he shook my hand, said we could go. But then I started to worry that we needed a criteria because I didn't want him to say just, the window was curved. So I said, how about if we stop for fuel? If we have to stop for fuel, then you're right. But if we don't have to stop for fuel, then I'm right because, the difference between 1,000 miles, 24,000 miles. Shook my hand again, but then he took it back. And that was when the conversation got very interesting because he said that he thought that maybe the entire history of air travel was a hoax, that planes never actually needed to stop to refuel. And that's about the biggest conspiracy theory that you could ever imagine.
I mean, this is, you've really put your finger on the difficulty here, which is you can make one step forward of progress, but inevitably you're going to find yourself taking two steps backwards after that as well. How frustrating at the end of the day was that conversation for you?
Well, it was frustrating, but I made a smart decision, which is that I didn't just say, okay, well then, and get up to leave. I continued the conversation because it's, as I said, it's really about changing people's mind over time. And if you hurt the relationship, if you yell or you insult the person, then the relationship is really over and they're not listening anymore. What I wanted to do was just leave that idea linger with him, that he had said to me at the beginning that there was something that could change his mind, but that both of the things we talked about, ultimately he took back. Now, I could have been smarmy and said to him, well, I guess your view is based on faith then. But I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to continue the conversation because I was playing the long game. Maybe over time he would begin to sit with that and it would bother him.
One of the things I gather you discovered about some of the people at the Flat Earth Convention is that at some point in their backgrounds, they have experienced rather profound trauma. Why was that a significant revelation to you?
Yeah, I never expected this. This was a complete shock to me, and it was only about the third or fourth person that I spoke with that I started to think, is there a pattern here? A number of them had mentioned to me, I wanted to ask them, how did you get into flat Earth? What was your genesis story, if you will? And a number of them said that it was when they had this major breach of distrust in their life because something had gone wrong. Either it was an illness where they didn't trust their doctors, or a personal crisis where they were divorced or something, or broke off a relationship. For some of them, it was 9/11, where they reported that they just got skeptical that 9/11 could have been anything other than an inside job. It was too big, and that broke their trust. So for all of them, it was that their trust was broken. But the really intriguing part for me was how their trust got broken. And it was, for most of them, it was a question of trauma.
Here's an excerpt from the book. As I sat there, you write, I concluded that perhaps flat Earth wasn't so much a belief that someone would accept or reject on the basis of experimental evidence, but instead an identity. It could give purpose to your life. It created instant community bound together by common persecution. And perhaps it could explain some of the trauma and other difficulties you might have experienced in life as the elites in power were all corrupt and plotting against you. That feels, Lee, like a real breakthrough. Do you recall that Eureka moment?
I do, because it was the moment that I realized why facts weren't getting through. And it's because it's not about facts, it's about identity. You really, Jonathan Swift said it best, you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. So why are we out there talking to science deniers, just trying to bury them in facts? That's not going to work. It's really, it's about identity, and which means that you have to build up some sort of a human connection if you have any hope of converting them. And by the way, there are plenty of anecdotal accounts in the literature which show that this does actually work. That if you speak to somebody with an extremist belief about science or about other things, and you are a human being about it, and you show some empathy and calm and patience and respect, that can work. It doesn't always work, but it can work.
How difficult is it to create that kind of connection? And knowing, as I'm sure you do all the time you're trying to create that connection, that you think the person that you're dealing with is, how do I say this delicately? I'm missing a few screws along the way.
Here's the interesting part. In a face-to-face conversation, it's a rare person who wants to break the connection. So as I was trying to build up their trust in me, there's a sense in which they were trying to do the same thing, right? So I had to put out of my mind the idea of why they believed it and just talk to them about their logic, about the way that they were reasoning about evidence. Later, I came to another kind of an important conclusion, which was that most science deniers are in fact victims. They believe what they believe on the basis of disinformation that's provided to them by somebody else on purpose. And it was the day that I realized that science denial was not an accident, it was a lie. And that was another important breakthrough. So that made it a little bit easier to talk to folks, because I realized that they really weren't getting anything out of this, and that in some sense they were sort of miserable.
When the notion of trauma, of something in their past, when you might put that to somebody who was involved in some of these crazier theories, did anybody have a eureka moment in their lives saying, oh my goodness, maybe this is why I believe as I believe?
I didn't say that. To say to somebody, the reason you believe this is, and then fill in the blank with, whatever psychology you want, they're going to resist that. Mark Twain said it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. And so my job was not to try to say, this is because of your identity or your ideology. It was to talk about, well, tell me why you believe what you believe. Why do you believe this thing but not the other? Why do you trust this person but not that person? So I was doing something that has since come to be called technique rebuttal. I was recognizing that there's a blueprint to science denial reasoning, and I was trying to unpack that blueprint to see if I could get them to understand the contradictions. Another important moment in these conversations is to realize, as I said in the passage that you read, that in some sense this is about community. If you distrust, the elites, the scientists, the government officials, the teachers, the astronauts, and you trust other people, you're going to be cut off from some pretty important facts. And so I was trying to enlarge the circle of folks that they trusted. Now, the odds were really against me here because there were 650 flat earthers, and here I was, a stranger who didn't believe what they believed. But I took seriously the idea that if you could talk to people with respect, you could build trust and maybe get them to listen. And that was really my goal. It wasn't necessarily to change their mind, though that would have been great. It was to see if we could have a civil conversation, and we could.
Well, let's move on then from flat Earth to COVID-19 and the international pandemic. And we're going to put up a bit of a checklist here, which you have discovered are, essentially the same kinds of things that you run into when you run into people who want to essentially deny the accuracy of the science as it relates to this pandemic. For example, there's a cherry picking of information that takes place, or a reliance on conspiracy theories, or a use of fake experts, or illogical reasoning, or a reliance on impossible standards for scientific reasoning. And as you look at this checklist, Lee, how are the things on this checklist playing out as it relates to the pandemic and COVID-19?
Every one of the five has been checked. And in the book, I go through for every instance, anti-vax, COVID, GMO denial, evolution denial, all of it. I go through and I check off all those five boxes. That rubric is something that other researchers discovered, some cognitive scientists before me. And that's really the blueprint for science denial reasoning. There are examples of this, of course, with COVID-19 denial or mask denial, vaccine denial, however you want to think of it. When you hear people saying that Fauci is lying, that he's in cahoots with the CDC, or that he's making money on it, well, that's a conspiracy theory. Or when people will talk about somebody that they know who seemed to get sick after they'd had the COVID vaccine, that's cherry picking. And I mean, even then, you could say that's also reliance on fake experts, because for all the claims that people are dying as a result of the vaccine, there was a fact-checking organization the other day quoted in Politico called the Poynter Institute, which found that there were 0 cases that had credible evidence of people dying as a result of the COVID vaccine.
Now, with COVID vaccines, people want to see with anything, they want to see the evidence. And with COVID-19, it's particularly difficult to actually see the evidence. And of course, the long-term consequences beyond that are going to be difficult to see in this very moment. In which case, how do you try to convince people to trust evidence, particularly if they can't see it themselves?
That's a really important question, because you've gone to the heart of the idea here that science denial is not about doubt, it's about distrust. And so the folks who are saying, well, this hasn't been proven in any long-term study, that's true. I mean, scientists recognize that. But here's the thing that you have to realize. You have to compare the relative risk. So what's the risk that there might be something that would come down the road, a year or two from now, from the COVID vaccine, given an understanding of how vaccines work and their past history, not just this particular one. But also thinking about what is the likelihood that somebody who's unvaccinated might get COVID and face serious illness or even death. So there's such a thing as relative risk. Now, it is sometimes hard to get people to take that seriously. I had a back and forth with an anti-vax person by email that I was he claimed that there were 10,000 people that had died as a result of taking the COVID vaccine, which is just wrong. I mean, that number is just made up. And I asked him what his source was, and he told me it was an unreliable source. And then I said, look, even if you're correct, even if that outrageous number were true, it still might be a good idea to get the COVID vaccine because look at how many people have died of this, around the world. And he came back memorably with the claim that, well, that was ridiculous because no one had died of the had died of COVID anywhere in the world.
He thought nobody had died of COVID anywhere in the world.
In the world.
How do you
Correct.
have a conversation with somebody who believes that?
At that point, the conversation was over. I mean, there are some folks who are so far gone that there's really nothing that you can do. And I encourage people to understand that science denial exists on a spectrum. And the techniques that I'm talking about in the book can work on hardcore science deniers. There are case studies to show that they have worked, but they work best on people who are hearing scientific disinformation for the first time. So, get out there and speak to people who are the audience for science denial, the people who are confused, vaccine hesitant, if you want to think of it that way, before they go too far down that rabbit hole. Because here's the thing, if they begin to distrust for too long and they find community amongst the hardcore deniers, then they're going farther and farther down that rabbit hole, and it's harder and harder to reach them.
In your experience, is it possible to get somebody who's that deep down the rabbit hole to get them back into the land of the living and the thinking?
So in my personal experience, I've never succeeded in doing that. But again, there are anecdotal accounts that I've read in the literature. One of my favorite, this is about climate change, but it's maybe one that folks can verify the details on fairly easily. Jim Bridenstine is a member of the U.S. Congress, or he was, and he was a climate denier. And he gave a speech in the House floor saying all the things that people say when they don't think that global warming is real or that it's caused by humans. So, of course, what do you do with somebody like that? President Trump at the time appointed him to be the head of NASA. Well, Bridenstine was in that new job for about a month or two, and he completely changed his mind. He gave another speech in which he said, I was wrong. Climate change is real, and it's caused by humans. Now, why did he do that? I think it's because he began to trust the scientists at NASA. These were not the faceless, evil people in on the conspiracy anymore. These were the folks that he saw every day in the hallway, or he had lunch with them. He was their boss. And he learned that scientists are pretty warm and trustworthy people. And I think that's what changed his mind. And I discuss many cases in the book of anti-vaxxers who have changed their mind.
All right. Having said that, though, do you ever have those moments where you have second thoughts about your chosen field of study, given that we live in a time that it is, well, let's put it this way. This appears to be a particularly fact-free time in North American history. And do you ever sit there and wonder to yourself whether or not you are just banging your head on the wall far too much?
I sort of do, but what's my choice, right? Go hide out in the bunker. I mean, remember, I'm a philosopher, and for the first time that I can remember in my career, people on the news are talking about facts, truth, and evidence. It's my time to step up and to do something about this. This is why I got interested in this topic in the first place, in defending science and, thinking about how people got toxic beliefs and how to get out of them. So I'm really out there right now trying to recruit more people to take this problem seriously. Because here's the problem. If we don't take this problem seriously, it's only going to get worse. I don't see science denial going away. And worse than that, I think that it is causing reality denial, what some people have called post-truth. In the United States, we have people who are now members of QAnon or denying that the 2020 election was legitimate, or who think that the January 6th insurrectionists were just peaceful protesters, or worse, that they weren't even protesters, that they were members of Antifa in disguise. This is all part of reality denial. And if we don't fight back against denial, I think that we're in big trouble.
And in our last 30 seconds here, Lee, what will constitute success for your mission?
My mission is to write this book and publicize it and get more people convinced that they actually can have a role. You don't have to just walk away. There was an empirical study in the summer of 2019 which showed that technique rebuttal works, statistically significant result against science deniers, and we all have a role to play, not just the scientists, all of us, in talking to people who already trust and love us. Maybe pick out that cousin or uncle and have a calm, respectful conversation. You just might change their mind.
That sounds like great advice, and we are happy to have played our part tonight in giving you some airtime on TVO to discuss it. How to Talk to a Science Denier has brought Lee McIntyre to our airwaves tonight from Boston, Massachusetts. Lee, as always, great to have you on the agenda.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me back.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.